Welcome to the Lady Landlords podcast, where we empower women to gain financial independence through real estate investing. I'm your host, Becky Nova, founder of Lady Landlords. If you're ready to buy, manage, and grow your real estate portfolio, then let's get started. Thank you for joining us again for this week's episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. Today, we have Gisele Rosado joining us. We're going to talk all about trust, protecting yourself, really what we should be doing to think ahead for estate planning here. So, Gisele, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you?
Hey, Becky, thanks for having me. Doing well. How are you?
Good. So what I would always like us to start with on this, whenever I have a guest, is if you could just share a little bit about who you are with our audience.
So I am through and through a New Yorker. I was born in the Bronx. I grew up in the Parkchester area from age 0 to 7 and then moved upstate. My dad was an NYPD detective, now retired, but he did 33 years in the force. Very proud. So shout out to the guys in blue out there. Big supporter. And my mom was an administrator at Yonkers General Hospital during the Son of Sam days. So yeah, they've got some interesting stories, I gotta tell you. So just sitting around the dinner table at my house was never boring. But yeah. So I actually grew up in hospitals. My mom toted me around with her everywhere. So my dad working nights most of the time. I was a little hospital rat and followed all the nurses around. And I actually kind of really grew a love for medicine. So I didn't follow the traditional track to law school that most people do.
Right. Do people ever ask, like, I was so waiting for you to say, like, so I became a nurse and then now I switched to law. Was going into the medical field something that you ever considered?
Yes, actually, my undergrad degree is in biology and pre-med. So I wanted to go to medical school. But when I was getting ready to graduate, I quickly decided at the very last minute of the last semester of my senior year that I didn't want to spend 8 years after already completing 4 years of college to become a doctor. And then if I wanted to have a specialty, there was another couple of years after that. So I wanted to go the fast track route, do 2 to 3 years and start making some money because I watched enough episodes of Law and Order and thought that's how it went. And yeah, somebody fooled me, but it was a decision that I kind of made kind of off cuff. I quickly double majored, got my pre-law degree, and went off to law school. And that was that.
That's such a, what do you think it was that kind of drew you then to law, right? Because to then say, okay, cool, medical school is not necessarily right. I mean, there was just a ton of options. You could have said, hey, I don't need to go to graduate school or law school. Let's just go into the workforce now. Do you remember kind of what pointed you in the direction of law?
Well, my parents were very, very adamant about higher education. They both were, of immigrant parents or my mother actually was born in Puerto Rico and came over here when she was, I think, about 5 years old. Obviously, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, although it's just a territory. But, they did want me to be as educated as possible, and they were willing to do anything and everything to make that happen. So they did not want me to stop at an undergrad degree. They wanted me to have a postgraduate degree. They did not care what it was in, if it was business, if it was law, if it was medicine, if it was whatever it was. So I was very lucky that my parents pushed education for me and supported me in that way. So I really just had that mindset growing up, and in my household, that was just, the first primary focus was academia. So that's what I knew I had to do. And really, for women in the medical field at that point in time, and from seeing my mother, who was actually the first female head of administration in the hospital at that time, um, it was something that really pushed me to be the first woman doing something in a male dominated world. So that's why
Right.
I thought, you know what? Let me try this law thing. I know that it's primarily male dominated, but I want to see how I can make a difference. And of course, my dad having a law background. And I also had a cousin who was an attorney in upstate New York in Syracuse area. And she had just become a municipal judge. So that kind of also inspired me to kind of go that route and veer off a little bit and see what it
Gotcha.
could provide.
That's fantastic. So when you went when you went into law, did you know what you planned on specializing in or what area you wanted to focus in, or did that just kind of come naturally kind of down the line?
So, right into my first year of law school, I was lucky enough to be chosen for an internship with the felony C division of the Hillsborough County state attorneys. I did that, and that changed my life. That was definitely a pivotal moment for me. I thought, well, what is there other than criminal law? So let me do this. So I went there. There were a lot of young attorneys there. Pretty much the whole division, except for the manager of the division, were young attorneys,
Mm.
all in their 20s. And they were brilliant. They were very hardworking. They involved me in anything and everything. So I really got a hands-on and internal look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. I was involved in witness preparation. I was involved in voir dire, which is basically when you question a jury to select a jury. I arranged exhibits, put together exhibits, um,
Huh.
was able to go to crime scenes. I did pretty much everything, discovery, research, you name it. I did everything. Sat in on trials, um, went in on bench hearings, everything. It
Wow.
was pretty incredible. And the moment that I realized I did not want to be a criminal attorney is when I sat in on my first sentencing hearing, which didn't
Okay.
come until the end of my internship.
Gotcha.
Um, I'll never forget the case. It was actually a situation where a man had been convicted of having slashed and almost murdering his wife and his infant son. Um, the the wife had been sitting on the front steps holding their child, and he had assaulted her with a knife, um, to the point that her face was almost peeling from her skeletal structure.
Wow.
Um, and they showed the judge all of the pictures from the actual incident at the sentencing.
Right.
And he was able to testify at the sentencing as to why he should get life instead of the death sentence, because in Florida, obviously, the death sentence is still uh, something that
Right.
is legal there. So um,
Huh.
I I really couldn't hold it together. I'm an empath by nature, so I
It just
realized,
turned you
well,
off.
yeah, you can't keep your emotions together in the courtroom. You got to do something that's a little bit more civil. And then
Right. And
that's where
listen,
I went.
that's going to be very tough for so many different reasons. And I think
Yeah.
it's just as important as we kind of move through life sometimes to realize the things that we don't want to do just as much as the things that we do want to do. So if that was kind of what brought you to know this is not the right space, it really opened up the opportunity for you to go somewhere else that was a fit for you. So what is your expertise now that you focus on?
My expertise is real estate law. I also practice bankruptcy and wills, trust, and probate. But real estate really is my jam, and we do specialize in being investor-friendly attorneys. So
Mhm.
we work with a lot of real estate investors and lady landlords.
Right. Well, that's why I thought the fact that your expertise was real estate law and the wills and trusts, I was like, this is just perfect to have you on to talk about this topic, since you can really talk about it from our perspective as investors. And just for anybody else out there,
Yeah.
we actually, Gisele and I connected through networking. So another reason why you should be attending your local meetups, why you should really be getting out there and know your fellow lady landlords, because you never know where the relationships are going to connect. So Yaritza, thank you very much for putting Gisele and I in touch, and making sure that we were able to connect. So a little shout out to her. But
Yes.
so Gisele, for just kind of where to start, can you just like tell us like what a trust is? How is that different than a will? Because all these terms are probably new to some of our listeners.
Absolutely. So a will is something that you are creating to put down your wishes for when you are obviously no longer here. And then your will has to be probated. Probate in New York, on average, takes approximately 2 years to complete. It's also very costly. So it is something that, your your heirs are going to have to deal with. It's there's also expenses that they're going to have to incur in doing the probate proceeding itself. And if there's no provisions that you've left behind to cover those costs and expenses, that's going to be a burden at the end. Um, Normally, some people put, a life insurance policy together, and put the costs of their funeral expenses and the cost of probate into that, so that, and but what I mean by into that is the amount of what's going to be distributed at the end to the beneficiary is meant for the covering of those costs, so that
Right.
it's not a burden on the actual beneficiary. But there's there's an opportunity for creating a trust within your will as well. So there's usually two types of methods for trusts. You can either do it testamentary or living. So, testamentary would be where you create a trust within your will, and a living trust
Okay.
would be a trust that you have while you're alive and separate and apart from any will that you may or may not have. And within that testamentary versus living, you break that down further into what's called revocable versus irrevocable. Um, there's several nuances to those as well. But really, a trust is an asset holding arrangement that pretty much gives one party the legal right to manage the property on behalf of another. And there's three different roles in a trust. You've got the
Mhm.
grantor who actually funds the trust, the beneficiary who's going to benefit from it, and the trustee who manages the trust property for the beneficiary. Now, depending on which type of trust you pick, sometimes the grantor, the person who creates the trust, can also be the trustee who manages the trust, or the grantor can
Perfect.
also be the beneficiary.
Okay.
So
The
there's
grantor
lots of
can be
ways,
the beneficiary.
depending on which kind of trust
Right.
you're trying to
Just as an
create
option.
and purpose. Mhm.
Interesting. I mean, that was actually gonna be one of my questions was if the guarantor, the person that funds the trust, could also be the person that's actually managing it, for the beneficiary. So that's good to know that that is an option. And but that's interesting that in some ways of the same person could be the guarantor as much as they could be the beneficiary. So yeah, I feel like those are
Yes.
most of us know trusts in the sense of trust funds, just for people that have loads of money that really are these inheritances. And that's really, I feel like, what most people think of when we think of trust is trust funds. But that's really not the case. Are trusts something that the average woman should really have when investing in real estate?
Well, wills are something that if they go to probate, those surrogacy proceedings are of public record. So that's something that's going to have to actually be filed with the court, becomes public record. And that's something that eventually can be found out if someone knows where to look.
Mhm.
Trusts are not recorded or filed, so they're not public record, and that gives you some sort of anonymity. You
Hmm.
know, us women are living an average of 5 years longer than men, and we're likely to be widowed by the age of 65. We also have unique financial challenges because we have shorter work histories, because we put our careers on hold to raise kids. And sometimes this causes a break in pay because we have to reduce the amount of savings that we accumulate for retirement due to pausing our careers to raise our families. So it's even more reason why we should be thinking about planning and putting a strategy in place to protect our assets. I
Right.
I think trusts are a great way to do that. Um, and speaking in terms of what most people call land trusts, because that's a broad term being thrown around, and it's popular. But New York notoriously does not recognize land trusts in the sense that most investors use it. Let's face it,
Okay.
we've seen bigger pockets, we've seen fortune builders. We know that land trust is something that most investors on these platforms really push.
Mhm.
But in New York, the term land trust is something that's actually created by Article 45 of the New York Environmental Conservation Law.
Hmm.
So it's used for preservation purposes. So environmental conservation, things like that. Pretty much for governmental and quasi-governmental and charitable entities.
Mhm.
So it's not something that if you go to an attorney and say, hey, I want to create a land trust, they're going to say, sure. They're probably going to look at you a little funny. So,
And they'll do it,
um,
but it's not sounding like
um,
that's really what we should be using when it comes to estate planning.
yeah, no, it's not a land trust that you're really looking for. You're looking for a grantor trust, either revocable or irrevocable, depending on what your goals are. There's also the popular, what's called domestic asset protection trust that's being thrown out there a lot, or
Okay.
DAPT. Um, Now, New York also doesn't recognize DAPT. So, what
Interesting.
is DAPT? So, of course, New York doesn't recognize a lot of things, but you got somebody out there that's professional and that's experienced in this. There are ways to work around it, but you can be a New York resident and create a DAPT trust in another state that does recognize it.
Okay.
There are about 20 states that do recognize those trusts,
Mhm.
and the closest states to us probably are Connecticut, Delaware, New Hampshire.
Oh, so we're not talking
Um,
far at all, right?
no,
Connecticut.
no.
Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not far at all. The caveat to those DAPs are that the trustee must be located in the state where the DAPT is created. So if you have a Connecticut DAPT, the trustee has to be in that state.
Okay.
But the grantor, if you're the New York grantor, you
Mhm.
can also be the beneficiary of that.
Okay.
Um, DAP trusts are also what's called spendthrift trusts.
Mhm.
Now, spendthrift means that the trustee has a nice tight rein on how much you can spend, um, and what you're allowed, what the beneficiary or the grantor, because they're the same person, is allowed
Mhm.
to utilize out of the trust assets. The benefit of that is you're protected from creditors.
Okay.
Each state has a few exceptions, so you have to check the state's laws, but state
Mhm.
like Nevada has no exceptions. So it doesn't matter if you owe alimony, child support, have judgment creditors, owe taxes. There are no exceptions. They can't touch anything that's in there.
That's good to know. Because I feel like that's
Yeah.
one of the major questions that, well, as we're doing estate planning and thinking about, I feel like a lot of women are then saying, well, what will break into my trust, right? I think a lot of women look to leave their portfolios to their children when they pass and have
Mhm.
that passed down. And clearly, we want to make sure that our kids get it's as easy as it's possible to actually transfer it, to make sure that those assets can move quickly to be able to help the survivors of our family. And then also to make
Right.
sure that they get the most amount of money, the most amount of property out of those items. So when you're
Exactly.
working, when you're working with real estate investors, let's say someone came to you, you did a transaction, you closed a property for them, and they said, "Hey, while we're talking, what is the best way for me to be able to pass on my assets?" Where does the conversation usually go at that point?
It typically goes to a trust. If it's a
Yeah.
long-term hold, I typically recommend an irrevocable trust.
Okay.
Most people think that irrevocable trusts are the end all be all, and irrevocable means irrevocable, as in you have absolutely no control over your assets, which to an extent is mildly true.
Okay.
With an irrevocable trust, and mind you, all trusts stay out of probate. So upon your passing, your heirs do not have to take this trust document to the court to have any permission to do anything. They do not incur any additional costs. The front end setup of the trust may cost a little bit. Yeah, there is an upfront cost, but it is
Okay.
much less expensive than going through anything through probate. But as far as an irrevocable trust goes, there are things that you can do to be able to amend certain things within the trust. And irrevocable, despite the name, although, you know, for the most part, only the trustee is going to be able to maneuver whatever assets are in the trust
Mhm.
according to the instructions in the trust that you create. And no trust assets will be able to be removed or um, distributed other than according to the trust instructions. You are allowed to make amendments to that, provided all of the beneficiaries and the trustee um, consent in writing. And also, you can put in a power of appointment, which allows you to swap out a beneficiary in the
Okay.
event you have a falling out with an relative, or your son puts you in a nursing home and you now favor your daughter. You can you can do these things. So it's not entirely out of your control for those
Okay.
types of things. The benefit of an irrevocable trust versus a revocable trust is whatever assets are put into the trust are not touchable by any creditors. um, Again, you have to remember, though, that whatever debts that are incurred by whatever assets are put in there, um, must we have to put the assets in there. You want to create the trust and put your assets in there before you incur any debts on them, because
Okay.
anything that was incurred or became a lien or attached prior to you placing that asset in the trust is not necessarily protected from that creditor.
Gotcha. So don't know if I want to go down that path yet. Got it. So when we're talking, so that irrevocable trust is really a place, there's kind of a jumping off point that would make sense for a lot of real estate investors. Now, you hear sometimes people actually purchasing the property as a
Mm-hmm.
trust, where the trust
Mm-hmm.
assets actually purchase that property and then becomes the owner of the property. And then you hear of the other version where people will still own their properties, either in their personal name or in an LLC, but then yet they want to have that held in a trust. Which is the proper, maybe not necessarily the proper way, which is really the best way to protect yourself and be able to leave things to your family in the longer term?
A lot of times what we do is we will do a because you're buying and holding or fixing and flipping, or you're probably not going to, depending on your circumstances,
Right.
hold the property for more than maybe 3 to 5 years. If you are doing a rental,
Hmm.
um, we'll do a revocable trust, which doesn't necessarily shelter you from creditors, but it will provide that anonymity.
Hmm.
And in New York, with our transfer forms that we have to file, we know that LLCs have to disclose their members. So you're going to be easy to find if you're just operating as an LLC, and especially if you're operating in your individual name.
Right.
But what I do is I'll create that revocable trust, and then I'll have the LLC with the individual being the sole member, or even having multi-member, the LLC be the beneficiary. And then you can either transfer interest in the LLC without touching the trust, or you can go ahead and, transfer within the trust. So you can do it both ways. It gives you a little more flexibility that way. You can also do it in the reverse by creating the LLC and have the trust be the member of the LLC. So those two options create the most protection and the most anonymity.
So the trust could be the member of the LLC.
Yes.
Gotcha. That's interesting, because what I was gonna bring up next was that a lot of us like to use the LLC because of the limited liability of the corporation, the LLC
Yeah.
holder. So is that something, and then I was gonna ask, like, is there any type of limit to liability through a trust? But what you're really saying is that to be able to use the trust and the LLC together really kind of maximizes the control you have over your
Absolutely.
assets.
Absolutely. And it's a little bit easier to structure it with the trust being a member of the LLC, because when you go for financing and you're getting a commercial loan, the lender's oftentimes going to require you, if you are holding the property in a trust, to transfer the property back into either your LLC, or if this is a commercial loan, or you're going to have to get a loan in your individual name and have you transfer the trust into your individual name. Many lenders, you'll find, will not lend to a trust entity. So
In
that's another
commercial or
caveat to look out
residential
for.
as well?
Both.
Okay. They won't lend to a trust because, once again, it's almost like setting up a brand new LLC. There's no credit to it. There's no business history. There's no transaction. There's usually not funds, all of those things that if when you create a new LLC to purchase that first property in, but yet that LLC now has never done business, it's going to be very difficult to get business
Correct.
credit to get a loan because you just opened a business yesterday. So same thing with the
Right.
trust, kind of from a similar kind of aspect here, that the trust itself wouldn't have then the other assets or really a history for a lender to feel secure by that trust, if I'm hearing that correct.
Yes, but especially, I mean, especially if it's irrevocable, then the lender will be completely limited to the property itself. They will have
Right.
no recourse as to any deficiency if they were to foreclose on the parcel and there's a large difference between what they end up getting for the property and what you owed on the property. They have no recourse if it's a trust and
Because
it's
since it's the
irrevocable.
irrevocable trust, because creditors can't come back. So the lender can't say, well, you
Correct.
defaulted, so I'm going to come and take the house,
Right.
because the whole point of the trust is so that way that they can't come and collect. So clearly a lender is not going to take that risk. We'd all be buying an irrevocable trusts and just never paying again if it was that easy. So that's why you're saying that usually a better course to go is to have the trust be the member of the LLC and then
Correct.
purchase the property as the LLC.
Correct.
I like
Just
that.
makes it easier for the amount of transactions that most of us will be doing and the times that we're going to be, if we're doing the Burr method, refinancing, or anything to that effect. It also makes it easier for insurance purposes and liability in general.
Right. Well, that's what I like about this, because what I was worried was
Mhm.
that when you change the structure, I didn't want it to end up being, and I'm so happy we had this conversation, because you want to make
Mhm.
sure that we can protect our assets, that and we want to do that now, today, by limiting our liability, but we also want to then do this through an estate planning perspective. And I'm really happy to hear that there are solutions that aren't one or the other, but there's really a way that you can kind of get both of those in the same place. What
Yeah.
happens to
Yeah.
all the other listeners out there right now that are saying, why didn't I know this before? Now it's too late. What can they
It's
do to restructure, is it still possible to do that? Because you can still move a property in between LLCs or from your personal name to an LLC. Are you still able to then do that with then using the trust in this fashion?
It's never too late, and
Perfect.
nothing's impossible. Everything's fixable is the motto in my office. So um, everything's fixable. Yeah, you can come see us, or you can come see your local. If you're out of state, your local real estate and wills, trust, and estate attorney, because it's going to need both. You're going to need to establish a trust, and you're going to want to talk with your, local counsel, depending on what state you're in. The rules are different in every state. So determining on, whether you want it to be revocable or irrevocable, what your goals are long term. And
Mhm.
then after you establish that trust, you're going to need to take your operating agreement and, depending on who your members are, decide, how much equity interest you're going to give this trust, um,
Right.
in the whole structure of it. So, and is your LLC a holding company, or is your LLC, you know, just you? So you've really got to kind of look at the big picture, see what the purpose of this is going to be. How
Right.
many doors are you holding? Is this going to be, what is the purpose of this LLC specifically? Are you going to use this trust as a member in, multiple LLCs, and how is that going to be distributed?
Right.
So, and you still have to keep in mind that, um, whenever you transfer an interest in New York, um, of 50% of an LLC that primarily holds real estate, you are going to be paying transfer tax on that transfer, even if it's to a trust. So,
Gotcha. So once again, we can fix now, but really the way that we should start thinking about this from the very beginning and really be purchasing
yes.
properties correctly at the start. What about for our
Yeah,
listeners that are like, well, I only own one or two properties? Is this still something that they should be thinking about?
absolutely. So, once you refi or sell that one or two properties that you have, before you go ahead and put that into your next investment, go set up your trust, create a brand new LLC, and start fresh. It's possible. You have a clean slate. You don't have to worry about any prior creditors coming out. The key to all of this is segregation. The
Mhm.
more you can keep everything separate, the better it is for you. And the, the harder it's going to be for your creditors to create a nexus. So,
Right. Okay. I have to ask this, and I'm not saying that you would know the answer to this, but I just have to ask it. If leaving assets through a will has to go through then probate, which could take years, there's cost to it. It sounds like a headache, really to kind of go through that. And I feel like you hear about that all the time.
mhm.
Why, why don't more people do this and avoid having to go through probate? Like
Cost.
cost. Okay.
I think it's cost is what I believe I hear. Um, I can tell you that most other attorneys out there, the starting price for a trust creation
Mhm.
is around $4,000 or $5,000. That's not our price, but that's what most of
Right.
the going rate is out there.
Okay.
The cost to create a will, anywhere from $200 to $500. So the cost differential is huge.
Right.
And that's why people just, kind of walk away from it.
Huh.
Another thing is, I just don't think people truly understand the difference. And they think as long as I have a will, everything's going to be taken care of. They
Right.
don't realize that the will has to actually be taken to court in order for anyone to have any authority to do anything that you've written in there.
Right.
So,
And I do see that. I do see
yeah.
the education side of that. But I feel like And once again, I feel like this is more of just, and this is completely why I wanted you on this episode to discuss this. Um,
Yeah.
but I feel like though, if you ended up going to court to enforce the will and through probate, I and fine, it cost you $500 to do your will. But
Mhm.
now you go through probate and now you have to pay whatever taxes, fees that are associated with that. I feel like if that's either going to end up being the same as the $3,500, if not more, than if you had
Oh
just put
yeah.
it in the trust in the first place.
The
It's
cost
not
of
it's not your
probate of
problem
an
anymore.
average
Now,
person's estate is like between, for just for attorney's fees, is between five and $10,000 of an average person's estate. That's not counting the payment of what you just said,
right.
taxes, any creditors that may have been still in existence at the time of the deceased's passing.
Mhm.
Um, there's still outstanding items that need to be done. Then also the trustee is going to get paid for dispersing and distributing everything. So there's tons of things that need to, I'm sorry, that's the trustee, the executor for probate. So there's lots of expenses involved in probate.
Right.
So, but I think people, when they're doing their will, they're thinking, I'm going to be dead. What do I care? it's not,
Correct.
it's not
I
something
was
that they're not
just gonna
really.
say the probate, the
Mhm.
cost of creating the trust is on us. The
Yeah.
cost of paying the probate and the taxes, we ain't around for that part. Right? But if the
Yeah.
whole point,
Yes.
if the whole point, and maybe this is just because our community is a little bit different. We are women, we are those that are usually looking to leave these assets. Most women in the community are really looking to build this for their families. So the
Yeah.
idea really, maybe we're a little bit skewed here because I would feel that most people in the community would be saying, well, if I'm going to build this portfolio and this is really what I want to do for my family, we're thinking ahead saying, well, we don't want then our kids to be burdened by these taxes and probate court. So we should be thinking ahead to then what can I do now to really make sure that this can transfer so much faster and so much more cheaply to my family,
Mhm.
which was my original goal anyways. Um,
Absolutely.
and I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from women in our community that either someone passed away, the family started fighting over a property, nothing happened with it, it went into complete disrepair, they had to sell it at a loss or just not as much money as they could have if, the ants stopped fighting so much. Um, or what's also been interesting is I've heard a lot of stories about while they're going through probate about tenants that just now don't have to pay. Or not that they don't have to, but they just stop paying. But since it's still
Mhm.
in probate, who's supposed to evict them?
Yeah.
They can just be there and then they can that's where either like things get kind of taken advantage of or nobody's really managing it. Now you also get tenant complaints because cool, there's a leak. Well, it's in probate for
Mhm.
2 years. Who's going to go and fix that leak? Who's paying for it? Who's even responsible for the tenant to even have to call in the first place? Let alone who's actually going to be managing that property and who gets the proceeds from the rents coming in at that point in time. So it also
Right.
sounds like this creates really better continuity within a rental property.
Absolutely. Because you have a trustee that's going to be continuously managing you know, the asset. And if anything happens to that trustee, you are going to have a successor already alternatively selected within your trust document as well. So
You just read my mind.
there's a
I was just
backup.
going to say, what happens if the trustee dies? So,
Yeah, you're going to
um,
have an alternate picked already. So
wait, okay. What I know we have a couple more minutes here, but I wanted to ask, what is the number one problem that women come to you with estate planning?
I think the number one problem that they come to me with is either they are, single moms. Um, they were never married, but they want to make sure that their kids get everything. And God forbid, their kids are still minors at the time of their passing, that because the guardian is going to end up being the biological father or the older parent, then they don't want the possibility of anything that they're leaving behind to their children to get to the hands of the guardian.
Right.
So what do I do in that situation? Well, that's where the trust is going to be the most convenient, because that's not going to happen. You're going to put provisions in there to make sure that the trustee that you have selected and the successor that you have selected are going to be managing those funds until your child has reached the age of majority. And then
Right.
they'll be, or whatever age you think they're going to be fit enough to manage the assets you're leaving to them. It doesn't have to be 18, it doesn't have to be 21. You can say 35, because
Right.
maybe you're preserving this for a specific purpose, for it to be their marital home when they reach that age and time in their life.
Right.
Or maybe you want it for your grandchildren and not even your children. So, there's provisions that you can put in place, and all of that is much simpler to delineate within a trust, and something that you really don't have to worry about when you put it in a trust versus doing it any other way. Because with a will, again, you never know if someone is actually going to take that will to have it probated. I mean, that's just
Right.
up to, that's up to everybody. When you're gone, that's not something that necessarily will be proactively done. So a trust is in existence while you're alive, and afterwards.
Right.
Nothing's changed.
It also makes it much more clear that you can express your wishes in a much more clear form, it sounds like, at that time.
Hmm.
Very helpful. Okay. Um, Anything else that I kind of haven't asked that we should know about trusts, wills when it comes to real estate investing? Or did we kind of cover the best options here?
Yeah, no, I just insurance. Insurance is definitely something that you can't forget about. I mean, it's your first, second, and third line of protection also. So, I mean, it's a
Right.
combination of your entity structure, also incorporating some estate planning and some succession planning tools, either it be a trust, whichever trust structure you choose, a revocable, an irrevocable, adapt, um, uh, or if you choose to go into another state where land trusts are recognized, because states like Wyoming and Nevada, they all have land trust laws. It's just not something that's statutorily recognized here in New York, but
Interesting.
there are states there.
Okay.
So yeah, the combination of it, but yeah, insurance is definitely always a must. So
Right.
keep those three
Exactly. We
things in
have to
mind.
look at these different options and really create the best package for the situation we're in. Thank you, Gisele. This was great. I know I personally learned a lot about different options, so I know our ladies got value out of that. So thank you very much. For any of our listeners that happen to be in the New York area, I'll make sure to put Gisele's contact down in the show notes. So feel free to reach out if you would like some more information on trust. But Gisele, thank you so much for being here for today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was awesome.
Of course. For
Glad
all of
to.
our listeners, please do make sure to hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. We release new episodes on Tuesday, and I will see you all back in the Lady Landlords Facebook group.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're feeling stuck in your real estate journey, visit lady-landlords.com to book a one-on-one workshop with me. I'll help you determine your next best strategy. Or you could subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive tips and offers. Invest with confidence. Become a lady landlord today.